Greetings, this is Chapter 8. We'll be talking about trade. We've already talked in general about globalization, so let's get into a little bit more detail here. Got two basic types of views with the trade system. We have what we'll call economic nationalism, which is looking at trade more from an inward viewpoint to benefit the country. And this has its roots in the system of mercantilism, which was very powerful during the colonial period. Obviously, it's not the same today, but has its roots there, where the state directs its economy to serve its interests at the expense of others. This wealth then is translated to power. So you're looking at building up a trade surplus, stockpiling gold, things like that. Mercantilism started to decline back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, when powerful states had more to gain from free trade than from protectionism. So this is a trend that we still see today, that protectionism provides you some benefits, and then at some point that it's going to play out and you're going to want to open up so that this system that you've created, you can start selling products to other countries. More on economic nationalism. Strong government action is used to promote and protect domestic industries. We'll talk more in detail about protectionism, which is protecting them from foreign competition for the most part. This includes subsidies where money is given to corporations for them to better compete in the global market. Includes government investment, transportation, education, infrastructure, which you may want to do anyway, regardless of what your economic regime is at the time. But these are things that are certainly geared towards national economy. This is typically viewed as a zero-sum game, which means that whatever I win, somebody else is going to lose. And there have been charges of neo-colonialism with respect to economic nationalism, where a country may be focusing more on its own self-interests at the expense of other countries. Let's look at the other side of that, and that would be what we call economic liberalism or internationalism, just to make it a little bit more clearly delineated. This is sometimes referred to as neoliberalism. This is where we are using economic cooperation between states to realize common gains. So this is more preference towards letting the global market system work, laissez-faire, which typically means hands-off, free trade, more of a non-zero-sum game to where we're both going to win something from this transaction, as well as the concept of comparative advantage, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail in a few minutes. The economic liberalist view typically is opposed to tariffs because that distorts the market, opposed to subsidies, opposed to sanctions and other restrictions, in order to let the free trade system, let the global market do what it does. In general, we're looking at mostly of a mixed economy here to get the benefits of capitalism while at the same time trying to control the abuses of capitalism. And we've talked in the previous chapter generally what the major concerns are of capitalism, and that is to watch out for monopolistic behavior. We've got to make sure the system is free and fair, so we're trying to ease unfair competition, unequal distribution, things like that. Ulysses S. Grant, during a meeting, kind of predicted how it works here back in 1870. After 2 centuries, England has found it convenient to adopt free trade because it thinks that protection can no longer offer it anything. Very well then, gentlemen, my knowledge of our country leads me to believe that within 200 years, when America has gotten out of protection all that it can offer, it too will adopt free trade. And he was about 100 years short on that, but fairly accurate prediction, is that's how it typically works, that you try to protect your industries to build up your economic system. And then once you've become an economic powerhouse like the United States became, well, then you're going to want to open up free trade so that you can sell your products to the rest of the world. China is in the process of doing that as we speak. Marxism is the general complaint about capitalism, where from Karl Marx's view, we're looking at an ongoing struggle between owners and workers. Some of that still plays out today. When you look at the advantages that corporate entities have, real wages have not gone up significantly. Looking at the dependency theory as well, that underdeveloped countries, poverty-stricken countries, and part of that is a result of exploitation by the rich countries. Here we call them EDCs. Not quite as conspiratorial as Marx visioned, because a lot of this is rational behavior, that the powerful countries are going to want to build a global economy in their wake, in their system. Poor countries serving the interest of the rich developed countries. Yes, some of that is true to a certain extent, as we'll see some of these maps and data. From the Marxist view, since capitalism is the only game in town, so to speak, that it could be supported if it was radically reformed. Let's look at the world market, which, again, we're approaching this more from the economic liberalist system or the internationalist system, is that if you have a bigger market, the larger market, such as the world market, you have a larger bargaining space to deal with, where the difference between the lowest price that the seller will accept and the highest price the buyer will pay, you've got more to work with there in order to find the best product for the best price. The world market would therefore theoretically reduce the leverage that one state can exert over another, considered more efficient from the liberalist point of view. Now, it doesn't always work that way because of the different states competing on the world market as well. And the supply-demand system, however, is not always stable, may not have free and equal information or free and fair competition across the board. But that's the general idea. The larger the market, the best product you're going to find for the best price, theoretically, the bigger you go. Looking at our so-called balance of trade from the United States point of view, U.S. for the past 3 decades or more has had a trade deficit where our imports exceed exports. Some of that obviously is, again, rational behavior of outsourcing to other countries where those products can be made cheaper and then be sold back to us. So the consumers typically benefit from that by getting cheaper products. The deficit as of 2017, and it has dropped just a little bit because of the Trump administration's more protectionist policies, has dropped a little bit, but still a large trade deficit. And the biggest chunk of this, of course, is with China. In order to make up that difference, what it does, it sells assets such as bonds and treasury bills to other countries. And that's one of the reasons why China is heavily invested in America, in order to make up that difference in that trade deficit. Here's where the majority of our U.S. exports go out there in the world. Canada and Mexico, 2 biggest recipients of U.S. exports. Here's where the biggest chunk of U.S. imports come from. China, as I've already mentioned, biggest supplier of U.S. imports. Canada, Mexico at the top there as well. Let's talk about comparative advantage, which is theoretically how the global trade system is motivated. It doesn't always work this way, but what we're looking at is that a state specializes in producing the goods that it has an advantage in producing and trading for goods that another state produces better. Now, this is sometimes called the computers for shoes analogy, where the United States is a technological powerhouse and can make computers, whereas maybe a less developed country in South America with a large labor pool can make shoes or garments, that sort of thing, cheaper or better, perhaps, and then so you trade one for the other. Let's look at another example of how it's somewhat practical for it to work this way. For example, Japan manufactures autos and imports oil from Saudi Arabia. One reason for that is that Japan does not have any significant oil resources. The other side of that, Saudi Arabia produces oil and imports cars from Japan because Saudi Arabia has massive oil reserves. Therefore, it would be less efficient for Japan to produce synthetic oil or for the Saudis to divert this capital and the labor that they have that's in the oil industry and to divert that into automaking. They could do that. It would take quite a bit of effort, particularly of government direction, in order to do that, and it still might not succeed. So that's why this comparative advantage is still a logical goal in the global trading system. However, when we've got an increasing amount of interconnection and interdependence, we've got cross-border flows of capital and technology and labor, makes this less relevant than perhaps it used to be, but still makes sense if you can buy a product from someone else cheaper or more efficiently than trying to go to all the effort of making it yourself. And that is actually a system called import substitution that did not pan out very well for the countries that tried it back in the 50s and the 60s. Looking at the free trade trade-offs, because there's winners and losers, this is the reason why trade has become such a political issue. In the Constitution is actually tasked to the Congress to regulate trade with foreign countries, but because it's such a political issue, that has pretty much been delegated completely over to the president's branch. Now, it's generally, when we go for free trade, we're benefiting the consumers for the most part, where we get generally cheaper prices and more choices for the consumers. But on the other side of that, these corporate cost savings have resulted in less jobs for people. So that's the trade-off. We're going to get cheaper products, but we might not have as many jobs or as many high-paying jobs that we used to have, particularly during the golden age of capitalism as we get out of World War II into the 1970s. So it's changed quite significantly since then, and free trade or globalization has been part of that equation. That's why there are debates on globalization. But let's see how, for example, China has capitalized on this. The United States now imports about 30% of its steel. China now has more steel making capacity than the rest of the world combined. So China planned that out in order to take advantage of that market. And then another thing that they did, which took some pretty amazing foresight to be able to do this, because back in the early 90s, before everyone had computers and everyone had smartphones, well, China started to capitalize and corner the rare earth metals market. Now, these are the very rare metals that are at the bottom of the chemistry chart, and these are very powerful magnets in some cases, very useful minerals and metals that are used in electronics and satellites and computers and cell phone technology, smartphones. So extremely important market here. China processes 97% of all the rare earth metals in the world, but it only has a third of the world reserves. The United States has the second largest volume of deposits. I think at last I looked, approximately about 30% of all the rare earth metals deposits in the world are in the United States. But look at this difference. So what would have to happen? Well, this is where the government would probably have to invest quite a bit of effort in protecting these industries that wanted to get into this rare earth metal market so that they could survive. Otherwise, they would not be able to compete with the Chinese that have already cornered this market. So this shows you how the political aspect of it is so important. This map here is looking at exports as a percentage of your GDP. And this is kind of a mixed bag here, but the main point wanting to make here is that the United States is at fairly low percentage. Now, political involvement when it comes to trade, The market is subject to imperfections that we've already talked about, tendency for monopolistic, oligopolistic behavior. Corruption is extremely low in the United States compared to other countries, but we still have to watch out for that when we're dealing with other countries. We also have the boom and bust cycles, the tendency to inequality. So the politics provide that legal framework at the state level, and that includes making property rights, contract law, rules and regulations, taxation, tariffs if needed. All of this, however, is less easily enforced in the international system because there's no global regulatory regime when it comes to trade and finance and corporate behavior. This is one of the reasons why, as I've mentioned before, corporations are gaining more power as they go global because they can pick and choose where they want to go in order to maximize their profit, increase their shareholder value, because they can play one country off against another when it comes to regulations and things like that. Talked about this before. While economic institutions are critical for determining whether a country is poor or prosperous, it's politics and political institutions that determine what economic institutions that a country has. On political intervention, sanctions, mentioned them a couple of times already. They are the most common go-to action as far as punishing another country out there in the world that's not doing something that either we want them to do or the global community wants them to do. These include trade embargoes, where we refuse to buy certain products, restrictions on their trade, freezing their assets that their wealthy citizens can't get a hold of, travel bans to and from the country, aid reductions, lots of things that you can do to put a sanction on another country in order to get their attention for them to change their behavior. The United States, as of the end of the year, had trade restrictions on 15 states. Several of these were sending out signals for human rights abuses. In sanctions, we got to be careful because they're not generally effective unless everybody is involved in that sanction. Otherwise, there's a back door or a way out for that country that's being targeted, and it's not going to really hurt them all that much. And at the same time, if everybody's putting a sanction on that country, it could really devastate their civil society, lost resources that are needed by the people in that country, whereas the leaders are probably still living very luxuriously, but their population is getting progressively hurt by the sanctions. Some examples: Western sanctions on Iran could potentially invited India to seek openings to get more oil through the back door there. So therefore, if India was not part of that sanction process, it really wouldn't hurt Iran all that much. Lots of examples out there. Russian sanctions on Armenia resulted in cutting the remittances to Armenia in half. Now, remittances is where workers go from one country to another in order to find jobs, and then they send that money back to their home country. And in some cases, remittances are a very large portion of their GDP, considerably more than foreign aid. Let's talk about protectionism, defined as manipulating trade in order to protect your domestic industries from foreign competition. So there's several reasons why you'd want to do that. Shelter an infant industry, even through an example a minute ago. If somebody wanted to get into the rare earth metal industry, they would need considerable protection, breathing room in order to succeed against that foreign competition, particularly China that has already cornered that market. Could be catering to demands of very important industries that the country feels like that we want this company to succeed, or this industry to flourish, so we want to help them out. Or it could be an industry that's vital to national security, whether it's weapons manufacturers or cybersecurity type industries. Those are important to national security, so the country may want to protect them. Or it could be a defensive effort to ward off predatory practices from other countries. We want to protect our countries from those predatory practices of lowballing prices or other types of intervention. Some more forms of protectionism are tariff barriers, taxes on foreign goods. That's a source of revenue. Prior to the 1900s, tariffs was the biggest source of revenue for the federal government. But as we said, when we made that transition, as we became an economic powerhouse, we wanted to open up our economy so that we could sell products to the rest of the world. So we had to lower those tariff barriers. Therefore, tariffs now on the global system are considered somewhat of a distortion of prices. But if we want to protect certain things from other countries, and with the Trump administration, he was elected on the agenda that he was going to be more protectionist, more nationalist leaning economy. That's one of the reasons why he got elected. So then the tariffs started to pop up on China and other places. There's other non-tariff barriers as well, such as setting quotas. For example, the EU sets amount of textile imports from China. The U.S. has quotas on sugar. Talk about that again in just a second. We've got some administrative barriers, which we can put restrictions on certain products from certain countries, or more regulations or higher licensing requirements, or place higher standards on their environmental requirements or their safety requirements, their health requirements. We can make them more strict as far as their labeling requirements. The EU has, over the past few years, been resistant to genetically modified crops. That's coming down now as more science reveals that there's not, technically any harm from genetically modified crops, and we might actually have to increase our GM crops in order to feed the number of human beings that we're going to have on this planet. Protectionism, one of the arguments against protectionism, particularly from the economic liberalist view, is that it benefits a handful of people quite a lot while increasing costs to consumers. An example is that citizens pay approximately, well, we're talking about households here, households pay about $40 more per year on sugar because of these import restrictions that I talked about a minute ago up here with the U.S. quote on sugar. And this is why it works so effectively, is because the average consumer like me or you probably doesn't even notice that. I don't even look at the price of my sugar. I just go pull it off the shelf and throw it in my cart, and don't even realize that I may be paying $40 more per year for my sugar. But the very small number, a handful or so of sugar companies, big, it's oligopolistic behavior, just like most other sectors are. Well, those handful of sugar companies are reaping enormous additional revenue because of that. And then they use that additional revenue to continue to lobby federal government to keep up those quotas, keep up those import restrictions. So that's how it works. And another reason as to why it works so effectively is because the consumers are paying for it and may not even realize that they're paying for that protection. Some more examples of protectionism: monetary barriers, such as manipulating your exchange rate. China has been accused of doing this, and mainly because they are able to do it with the amount of foreign reserves that they have. Investment barriers. This is where we might want to limit foreign ownership of countries from other countries. Already talked about subsidies, government allowing industry to charge a lower price because they're getting money from the federal government to help produce that product, so they can charge that lower price for it. This is in the form of tax breaks, low-cost services, loans, perhaps low-interest loans, guaranteed prices, things like that. The concept of dumping is where a country will allow its corporations to sell products abroad at a lower price than it sells at home. So what they're trying to do is capture markets abroad, and the government may actually be helping them do that so that they can grab that market by putting companies out of business in foreign countries. And then once they get that business, then they can raise those prices back up. That's another form of protectionism. World Trade Organization is one of the biggest international organizations in the world. It's one of the big three that we talked about in the economic system that was established right there at the end of World War II. It had 155 member states and has been successful in reducing tariffs by 1/3 in order to try to kind of make the global market more free, more fair. They use this concept of reciprocity, which allows injured states to levy sanctions on the offending country. So they're kind of like a referee where when they throw the flag, the other country can do the same thing back to that country that did this to them, so that it will hopefully even out, and then they will both stop those infractions. They have what is called the most favored nation status, where the state's policies must be applied equally to all WTO members, but they do have what is called a generalized system of preferences, where concessions are made to poor states. And just like when the United States spent 100 years plus protecting their economy in order to build up their industry, well, the WTO understands that, yes, poor countries are going to have some advantages here and there in order to try to build up their domestic industries and then be able to compete more on the global market. There is a controversy over the rich countries' subsidies to agriculture. Both the EU and the United States pay billions of dollars in subsidies to their agricultural industry, and that puts a lot of the poor countries at a disadvantage, because a lot of the poor countries are kind of still very agricultural based, and they could have quite a few exports coming out of those countries, but yet still have to compete with the rich countries on those types of products. Here's an example of primary products as a percentage of merchandise exports. And what tends to happen here is that the higher your percentage of primary products are, the less developed you are. So that's just a fairly logical correlation, as you can see in Africa, where they are still using these poor states as suppliers of raw materials, minerals and ores, and in agricultural based products, that other countries are then taking those and then processing them into commodities that they can sell to the rest of the world. The poor countries, therefore, have not developed their industrial base to where they can use those primary products for their own productive capacity. They are still being used as a supplier to the rich countries, and then the rich countries are using that to for their industrial capacity to make commodities. So that you can see where that correlation is still a very strong one. Looking at some more trade issues, because it's a political situation, interest groups are lobbying for advantages. The multinational corporations are getting lots of advantages without much loyalty or allegiance to any particular country, but yet they are using their increasing profits to lobby governments in order to get cumulative advantages. So the trade is subject to politics. There's winners and losers. That's why it has been delegated over to the president's office to handle, because congressmen it's kind of a hot potato for them to handle and then have to deal with re-elections, things like that. Intellectual property rights has been a very predominant issue on the global scheme, where companies that create things like software, music, film, have to worry about piracy of those things. But the organization here that looks at intellectual property has been requiring developing states to enforce that. So we have, once again, a trade-off here, is that the WIPO attempts to regularize patents and copyright laws across the board, but there are some debates as to whether patents might not need to be spread out and benefited by other countries. Example, Monsanto has patented a seed that once you plant it, the seed dies and you can't use the plant to harvest seeds to go to your next crop. So therefore you have to buy new seeds every planting season, so that increases the profit of the corporation, but yet at the expense of the poor countries that rely on agriculture, that have to continue to buy those seeds each planting season. So there's a debate over intellectual property rights as to how much does it need to be maintained as far as the inventor of that to be able to reap profits off of that intellectual property, as opposed to spreading it out and letting more people access to that. Pharmaceutical drugs is another big example of that, where pharmacies are charging very high prices for drugs for a long period of time, where poor countries have to pay those prices when they could technically pay less for them if they were just on the open market. There's continued resistance to trade throughout. Workers in rich states, unions are worried about competition from cheap labor in the developing states. Human rights groups are concerned in that the working conditions in low-wage countries aren't as safe. There have been some cases where people have died in very poor working conditions in these countries, but yet the corporations from the rich states are benefiting from that cheaper labor. Environmental groups are also concerned because an unrestricted expansion of trade could be lowering environmental standards, and that is what we have been calling the race to the bottom. There's not an evidence that this is the goal, but it could be a potential, in that as countries vie for corporations to come in, we need you to come to our country and invest in our country and put people to work, well, then we're going to turn our back on environmental standards or safety standards. So therefore, we'll worry about that later. So that could be a lowering or undermining of standards. Some other concerns with consumer groups as well, in that as we go more and more global, there could be some safety concerns. And then the globalization system itself is not just driven by corporations, it has been most advantageous to corporations as well. So we've talked about a lot of stuff here with respect to trade, as to what the trade-offs are with that. So stay tuned for discussion forum for this chapter.